Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Change Committee's 7th podcast episode.
This podcast is run by the Climate Change Committee, a club based in Massachusetts dedicated to spreading awareness about climate change.
I'm Avanthika.
And I'm Sugita.
And we're today's hosts.
Today we're meeting with Freddie Gillespie, chair of the Native Pollination Systems Task Force of the Metro West Conservation Alliance. Hello, Freddie.
Hi there. So I'm Freddie Gillespie, and I'm actually a step back from the Native Pollination Systems Task Force. I guess I should have mentioned that before we met, but I still am doing the work with them and support what they're up to. I'm in Southborough. I'm the chair of the Open Space Preservation Commission, and that's how I ended up becoming involved with the task force. I have been working with land conservation and stewardship issues for over 20 years on the Open Space Commission, and it's led to some really great and rewarding projects and successes.
So we were wondering, what is the Sudbury Valley Trustees and what kind of work do you do with them?
So the Sudbury Valley Trustees would better suited to answer that question. They have many, many areas of expertise, but the main one for me is they're a land trust. They protect land, and they're a regional land trust covering 36 communities in our watershed, the Suasco watershed, and Southborough being in that watershed. We have worked with them, and I have been honored to have been able to, with their help, in Southborough, we have protected 150-acre farm, and I don't think that would have happened without their expertise. Every single land protection project that has been successful in Southborough since the early 2000s, when I got on the commission, we were partnering with SVT.
Yeah, it's definitely so important to protect land, and it's really good that you're so involved and have so many different projects that you're working on. But in regards to those projects and your work in general, what has your work done to kind of support local ecosystems in the land that your different organizations purchase? For example, what impact has your work made on the species Bombus vivertis?
Bombus vivertis is an at-risk species of bumblebees, which, as you have volunteered with me, you've heard me talk about him. And when I first started this work, we have a conservation land called Breakneck Hill Conservation Land. It's about 100 acres. And we'd been managing for pollinators. And I went to a workshop, and it was out in the western part of the state. And Dr. Robert G. Geer was talking about bumblebees. And when I got home, I thought, maybe he can come and take a tour of our conservation land and tell us, part of me, I wanted to hear how great we were doing, because we had spent a lot of time putting gardens in and managing the land for pollinators, and particularly milkweed for monarchs. We were successful in getting a lot of milkweed back on the land. And one of the things that happened was he came, and we were lucky that Bombus vivertis flew by right when he was at the land. And he was very excited because it used to be commonly found, and he hadn't seen one all season. Well, it turns out as we worked with him more, and he had done some citizen science training workshops with us on bumblebee identification, which is really critically needed. What we learned was that there historically had been 11 species of bumblebees in Massachusetts. 2 have been extirpated. Of those 2, one is on the National Endangered Species list, and the second one is being considered to be put on the National Endangered Species list. So Bombus vivertis used to be commonly seen, and it is now, when we first started, the state had a wildlife habitat report, and they said it had been extirpated from Massachusetts, and we knew that wasn't so because we saw it at Breakneck Hill, but it wasn't as common as it had been historically. Dr. G. Geer's research shows what the historic numbers were and what they're at now, and they've pretty much disappeared from our landscape. But his research also turned up which plants these at-risk species of, we started out with bumblebees at Breakneck Hill, but his research has gone on to other bees and butterflies. He created a list that said which plants it needed. And also, one of the most important things to know is bumblebees don't need just one kind of plant for nectar. They need 2 different classes of plants. One that they provides pollen for them, which creates the next generation of bees. And then the other is nectar. So with no pollen, no next generation, and no nectar, 24 to 48 hours without any nectar available, they're dead. And then there's no next generation. And then in 2020, we put in a garden with the plants. Dr. G. Gear's list finally came up with a list, his research, which plants would help. We put the garden in. We call it the Ecology Research Garden. And within a few weeks, the first plants that started blooming, there I am weeding, and all of a sudden, Bombus fervidus comes and lands on a plant right next to me. It was like I still get goosebumps right now thinking of it. It was so exciting. And that whole summer, and then again last summer, which was our second season, on different plants, we could count on them showing up on these plants. And it was real proof that Dr. G. Gear's, first his research was valuable, but also his theory that if you plant it, that saying, if you plant it, they will come. So we have a better population of Bombus fervidus on Breakneck Hill because of these plants that were put in, as well as we're managing the land differently.
I think it's really important to bring awareness to all these different types of bees. I don't think I even heard about Bombus fervidus before volunteering with you, where I learned so much about it. But what are the point of pollinator preservation gardens, and why are they so important?
It's not just the pollinator. So you'll see our signs call it pollination preservation. We're concerned about the relationship between the animal, which are the butterflies and the bees and birds that pollinate, and the plant. And they go hand in hand. And they're sort of like the foundation of our whole ecosystem. So what we find is that if you have, one of the things that became evident on Dr. G. Gear's list was that there are a lot of at-risk species of plants that these at-risk species of bees and butterflies use. And why is that? Well, you lose the pollinator, you lose the plant, you lose the plant, you lose the pollinator. And it became important because it doesn't just help at the pollinator level, like all of our plants, the diversity. What else do they support? And it goes up the chain. So insects are critically important for a food source for birds and other animals that then become, part of the chain of life all the way up. We're like at the top of the pyramid, and we always think we're something separate and different than nature. But when the whole pyramid collapses, eventually we will too. We're concerned about the native pollinators that, for the most part, unless you have a factory farm with hundreds of acres of the same crop, our native pollinators can take care of our small farms and gardens, pollinating them.
It's definitely important to be volunteering and to be pushing for these sorts of gardens to protect these endangered species. But along the lines of, pushing for these gardens, I think publicity is really important. And I know you mentioned that when I went volunteering. So what is the importance of having gardens with native plants on display in public areas such as libraries or town centers?
One, we want to get these plants everywhere. And where's everywhere? Well, everywhere is in people's yards, because, and that's a whole nother podcast, but we are completely covered with non-native plants, and we need native plants in our landscape. Caterpillars are the birds' baby food. In the past 50 years, we have lost 30% of our common backyard birds. Not rare at-risk species, common backyard birds. And there's many reasons for this, but one of them is they don't have enough food to feed their babies. Well, where do these caterpillars come from? The fact is, our insects, just like the bees with the native plants they need for pollen and nectar, all insects and the butterflies co-evolved with native plants. And when you drive around your neighborhood, if you took an inventory of all the yards, beyond the lawn, which is the huge portion of the property, there's no native plants. We are enamored of something else. It's always something better, like what came from Europe or Asia. We don't use native plants in our landscape. And that means when I drive around town now, I look and I'm pretty familiar with what's native and not. And I go, nope, nothing. And these yards are full of no food for the baby birds. So our goal is to introduce people to these plants by putting in gardens where they don't suspect. So the purpose of these lawns is not lawns, especially not lawns, sorry, of these gardens is when people are going about their daily business. They're going to the park, they're going to the library, they're going to the store. They come across one of these gardens and they say, wow, that's so pretty. And look at all those butterflies or a hummingbird. And that will entice them to want those plants at home. And we can do some education and also make the plants more available for people to purchase. So.
Yeah, I remember the first time we volunteered with you and you pointed out all of these plants that we see like every day. And you were like, these are not native. And ever since then, every time I go outside and I look at a plant, I always think about that. And so for people who want to incorporate more native species in their own personal gardens at their house, what do you think are some alternative ways to weed or maintain those? And what chemicals should and shouldn't be used?
Certainly organic is the way to go. So how you manage it is the same for whether they're native plants or not, right? Don't use chemicals. So we want people to say, oh boy, look at something's eating my plants. And that's a change. And people think, oh, it doesn't look as nice. There's a cure for that. Take 3 steps back. You won't see the holes in the leaves, and if it's a invasive species, that's a different topic, like the spotted lanternfly, which is headed our way, or the gypsy moth, that's a whole different topic. But for the most part, people use pesticide to kill native pollinator babies, the caterpillars and other insects that eat plants. So you don't want to do that. The other thing we say, don't mulch your gardens. So we put down, I don't know, this look became very popular. It keeps weeds down, but with native plants, we plant much closer together. We don't like to have like one plant and then mulch and then another plant over here. We want, a series of plants planted closely together, and that keeps the weeds out. When you put mulch down, 2 things happen. One, the landscaper that you have to buy the mulch from and lay the mulch down and, over and over again, they make a lot of money. You're spending money on stuff that if you just leave the leaves in the fall, that's a whole nother topic. Leaves are habitat for many overwintering insects that take a year. So when we rake our leaves and chop them up and ship them out, you're sending out, if you have native insects living in your yard, many of them are butterflies, live in the leaf litter and look like leaves. They curl up and they look like brown leaves. So we're actually killing it all there. And those leaves actually make good mulch for your plants if you need it. So leaving leaves, not cutting back the stems. So when you have, in the fall, everyone wants to clean up their garden. Like you're cleaning it up so it's not a habitat for the insects and animals. That is why we're planting them. So you want to leave them. And the benefit of that is they become a winter garden. People think we can, we're afraid of disease, so we spray the chemicals. People are creating habitat in their yards. They say, well, I can't let my kid go in the yard because of the ticks. I'm afraid to tell you, but you shouldn't let your kids go in your yard after you spray for ticks. So if you can't do a tick check, just keep your kids out of the yard, because when you put down these massive amount of chemicals, if you read what's in them, it's not sustainable for our planet, but it's not healthy long term. Your kid's not necessarily going to get sick right away, but long-term health, cancer and other serious other diseases and consequences of using these chemicals will become apparent in another 10, 20 years.
So our next question is kind of segueing away from personal gardens and is more about volunteering, which you're really good at organizing volunteers and telling them why they're volunteering. And we want to know your thoughts on the importance of organizing youth volunteers specifically and teaching them about the importance of their work.
So it was my great pleasure to work with the volunteers from the Climate Change Committee from the charter school. You guys were amazingly dedicated, and you never balked no matter what I asked. And, there was the time we had the slugs. I don't know if you were there for that, but some of the plants we were putting in were, I said, well, first there were slugs on the containers. Can you get those off? And, people stepped right up for that. And what I enjoyed most about it is not everything we did because things weren't ready was exactly related to the garden we were putting in. But it related to the overall effort of, the ecosystem. So sometimes we were at Breakneck Hill and that was weeding. And then sometimes we were over at the garden area. And one of the focus areas that the student volunteers, was the lawn alternative section, planting that. And that relates to climate change almost more than anything else we're talking about today. And maybe we'll get to that later. But, it may not interest you right now. When I always take time to talk about why we're doing what we're doing and then do the work. And then I was really happy to hear that you listened and now you look differently when you see landscape plants. Like that made a difference. And, that little piece of information that will stay with you. And you never know which piece of information is going to stay with someone.
It is so important for the youth to be like taking part in this, because if we don't, then who will, And those volunteering experiences really brought me out of my comfort zone. I mean, I used to be like so iffy about insects and stuff, but after all of those like volunteering days, it really changed my mindset. So moving on to the more actual climate change aspect, what are some changes that you've seen in the overall weather in our watershed due to climate change, and how have they affected wildlife and greenery?
We have talked about how insects and birds co-evolved with our native plants. So, for example, when I moved to Southborough, I had a crabapple tree in my backyard. And every year when it flowered, a Baltimore Orioles would show up and be in the tree. Now, back then, I thought it was there for the nectar, but it turns out it's there for the insects that are on the tree, because most of our birds are insect-eating birds. The Oriole, my tree's in bloom, and the Oriole wasn't there. And then like 2 weeks later, it's not in bloom. And I heard it because I could recognize its chirp, but it was flying by in the woods. And I'm like, why didn't it stop at my tree? And it was later, as I became more engaged and learning more about this coevolution, that I learned that my tree was now blooming 2 weeks earlier. The same thing happens with bumblebees. So a queen bumblebee hibernates and then she comes out of the ground. And remember I said that they need both nectar and pollen. So she needs nectar within 48 hours, 24 hours maybe. And if nothing's in bloom at that time, she's dead. And there's no hive and no next generation. And that whole line of that family is gone. So what we have seen is that some of these plants are blooming earlier. And now that's one of the things we're paying attention to. We have to keep feeding the next generation, or this is all coming, collapsing down around us. So that has been a big change, the timing. And why is the timing different? Because we're warming earlier.
To wrap things up and kind of leave a final suggestion for our viewers and for listeners, how would you recommend starting a native species garden, or even introducing native species into people's lawns and gardens for people interested?
Just 3 things for your viewers you can do. I have in Southborough, we have a Facebook group for those that are on Facebook. It's called Native Plant Gardens of Southborough. And that quickly on, we realized lots of people wanted to join that weren't from Southborough. And it's created a wonderful network of people who are all learning from each other and creating a network that way. So I'm really happy about that. We're also very fortunate in this area to have the Native Plant Trust. And their headquarters is at Garden in the Woods in Framingham. And I would Google them, Native Plant Trust. And they have courses, they have reading books, lots of materials. So doing that, and they sell plants. There's other places that sell plants as well. And actually, if anyone is interested, we're having our second round of winter sow seed giveaway. We have collected the seeds from all the plants at Breakneck Hill on Dr. G. Gear's list. We hand cleaned them and packaged them, and we're giving them away for free and showing people how to make milk jugs to plant the seeds in, and then they get the plants. It's a low-cost way and very rewarding to see the plants you grew from seed come up and take over. I shouldn't say take over, but you can have them in your garden, and you could make a garden. So I would say there's several books that you should read. And Native Plant Trust is a great resource to find the books on how to make do that, as well as the my Native Plant Gardens of Southborough Facebook group.
Do you have any words of wisdom, any final comments to the viewers watching?
We talk about creating these pollination preservation gardens, and like, how do you make change? And these are big gardens, and, put lots of plants in, and it's really important, but just put one plant in. Change happens. How do we make this happen? It's one landscape, one garden, one yard, one plant at a time. One of the things at home, really think twice about the chemicals you use in your yard. But we didn't talk about this so much. I mentioned the lawn alternatives. Lawns are one of the biggest catastrophes for climate change. We use way too many chemicals. Do you know that they're the largest crop in the United States? Bigger than any other farm crop. They're not native. They use more pesticide, water resources. The amount of gasoline spent mowing them and leaf blowing them, and the pollution caused by it is a real, it's a travesty. And it could be supporting, that area of land could be supporting many more wildlife and also using less resources. And the thing is that there's a need for lawns. We don't say get rid of your whole lawn. There's areas, but when you see these large 1 acre properties that have half an acre of lawn that nobody ever uses, it's like I like the saying, when you think about lawns, think scatter rugs, not wall-to-wall carpeting. Take a look at your yard and say, how much do I really need to be lawn? Get outside and plant one plant.
All right. Thank you so much for your advice. Thank you for your answers. That wraps up our interview. Thank you for your time, and thanks to all the viewers for watching. And this was the 7th episode of the Climate Change Committee.